Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Good evening and welcome to the British Academy. It's a wonderful moment to be able to welcome you back to this space and hear that buzz of conversation, because it's actually been well over a year, nearly 2 years, since we last had an in-person talk for the British Institute for the Study of Iraq. February 2020, we had Professor Nicholas Postgate talking to us about Saluki-like here. Seems a long time ago now, but I'm delighted to be able to welcome you all here this evening to, as it were, relaunch our in-person events after nearly 2 years of Zoom lectures. It's a terrific pleasure to be able to introduce the speaker this evening, because who better in a way to relaunch our live events for the Institute than our patron. And so I'm delighted to introduce Sir Terence Clarke. Say a few words of introduction about Sir Terence. After graduating from the RAF as a pilot officer and a Russian interpreter, he entered the diplomatic service in 1955. He studied Arabic at SOAS and the Middle East Center for Arabic Studies. He then served in Bahrain, Amman, Casablanca, Dubai, Belgrade, Muscat, and Bonn in the diplomatic service, and, of course, served as ambassador to Iraq between 1985 and 1989. He was knighted in 1990, and after which he returned to Muscat as ambassador to Oman between 1990 and 94. After that time, 1996, he became director of the International Crisis Group's Bosnia's project in Sarajevo. He was a senior consultant at the Middle East Consultants and a director of the Middle East Association. He is a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society and vice president of the Anglo-Omani Society, and was chairman of that society between 1995 and 2004. Of course, we know him as a deep friend and supporter of the British Institute for the Study of Iraq, but his interests are wide-ranging, as expressed in numerous publications, prolific author. Many articles on the history and the politics of the Middle East, as well as a number of books: Oman in Time, A Nation's History in 2001, Underground to Overseas, The Story of Petroleum Development in Oman, 2007, Oman's Invisible Energy, 2014, and then that key aspect that we'll hear about today, a book called, which sums it up really, The Salukis in My Life, in 2018. Co-authored The Saluki, Coursing Hound of the East, 1995, Dogs in Antiquity, 2001, and Al-Mansoon's book on hunting, and among many other books, including, of course, a book called Salukis in My Life, which we have a pile of here, and opportunities afterwards, I'm sure, to acquire one if you don't already have it on your library shelves. So it's with enormous pleasure that we relaunch the British Institute's lecture series with Sir Terence Clarke talking about the evolution of the Saluki as an enduring part of the cultural heritage of the Middle East. Please join me in welcoming him to the stage.
Thank you very much for that very generous introduction. And as you say, it's very good to be addressing people face to face again after such a long interval. And now, if I may use a turn of phrase by Monty Python, and now for something completely different. Much of BISI's raison d'etre is quite rightly the study of the past, of ancient peoples in Mesopotamia and their material legacies. This evening, however, I propose to deal with a part of Middle Eastern cultural heritage that uniquely links the prehistoric past with the present day in an unbroken continuum, namely the Saluki hunting hound. Now, I suspect that some, perhaps many of you, have never seen a Saluki in its native habitat. This is probably because they tend to be guarded carefully away from covetous eyes, I mean thieving, and thieving hands. Even if you are lucky enough to see one, it may look quite different from the image of the Saluki in the West, with its tall, elegant frame, more often than not generously feathered, that's long-haired, on ears and tail, whereas the native Saluki tends to carry much less feathering or is entirely smooth or short-haired and of smaller stature, often with cropped ears and henna-stained feet to prevent damage when hunting. For this is a working hound that has been bred for millennia, principally for coursing gazelle and hare over open terrain. So, what is it that makes a mere dog so special, particularly in a Middle Eastern context, where dogs in general are shunned? History shows that the Saluki is no ordinary dog. Indeed, it should never be referred in Arabic as kalb, dog, but only as Saluki or slugi, colloquially, or as al-hur, the free or noble one. In Persia, Persian-speaking areas, it's called tazi, possibly from the word tazidan, meaning to run. In Turkish or Turkic-speaking areas, it's called taze, which means fresh or clean. This special status is not of recent origin, for the Saluki has played an exceptional role in Middle Eastern societies for millennia, and not for nothing was it sometimes called the companion of kings, because it was so often portrayed in the company of rulers across the region, whether with an Egyptian pharaoh, see a couple of Salukis there, or with an Ottoman sultan. And notice the Salukis here also have henna on their feet, and indeed the tail, a custom which is clearly already over 500 years old. But its history goes back much farther into the cradle of civilization in Mesopotamia. It was here that the hunter-gatherers became settled farmers, and here that we find some of the earliest evidence of the emergence of a hunting hound that resembled the breed we know today as the Saluki. However, I must mention here in parentheses the discovery in 2012 of a stone figurine claimed as that of a Saluki at Al-Maqar in Najd, Saudi Arabia, among some 300 artifacts found at this Neolithic site. It was shown in an exhibition entitled The Horse, From Arabia to Ascot, at the British Museum in 2015, along with two other remarkable figurines of a horse in harness and a falcon, all dated at the exhibition to the 7th millennium BC. Research continues into the validity of these claims, but if confirmed, it would put the history of the domestication of the Saluki, not to mention the horse, as well as falconry, in a totally new perspective. But back to what we do know. Like all breeds of dog, the Saluki derives from the wolf, probably the smaller Arabian wolf than the European grey wolf. The process of its domestication and the development of a distinct breed of hunting hound took many thousands of years, whereas most of the breeds you see exhibited at crufts have been developed only over the past 150 years or so. It is clear from this skull, excavated in the 1930s from the debris in a well at the great archaeological mound of Tepe Gawra near Mosul in Iraq, that by the pre-Sumerian period of about 4,400 to 3,800 BC, a Saluki-type dog was already established, possibly because the great open plains there were as ideally suited then for coursing as they are today, as I was shown by nearby villages to Tepe Gawra. From Eridu in southern Iraq, reputed to be the oldest city of ancient Sumer, a skeleton described by Seton Lloyd as, quotes, probably of a Saluki-type dog, was excavated from a grave of a young boy in a cemetery dating to the early 4th millennium. Professors David and Joan Oates excavated at Tel Brak in northeast Syria the complete skeleton of a dog dating from about 2500 BC, which an expert at the British Natural History Museum described as, quotes, certainly of greyhound build. In fact, a comparison of the bones with those of one of the first Salukis to be imported to the UK from Egypt in 1895, whose skeleton has been preserved at the Natural History Museum, revealed striking similarities. The admittedly controversial British archaeologist James Mellart claimed to have discovered the earliest representation of a Saluki in a faded wall painting from the Halaf, a period of about 5,800 BC at Çatalhöyük in southeast Turkey. However, rather clearer are images from seal impressions in sun-dried clay from the Chalcolithic period of about 5,000 BC, which were described by the British excavators Sir Max Mallowan, perhaps more famous as Agatha Christie's husband, and J. Cruikshank Rose at Tel Arpachia near Mosul, as of some kind of coursing dog, perhaps a greyhound. About 300 similar seals and seal impressions were discovered at Tepe Gawra, showing many hounds in hunting scenes, and the excavators commented, quotes, the animals depicted are rarely of any domesticated variety, except for the commonly represented Saluki. Similar seals and seal impressions have been found at other sites in the area. A small copper figurine excavated by Seton Lloyd at Tel Aqrab, east of Baghdad, dating from the Sumerian period of about 3,600 BC, clearly shows a Saluki with lop ears. From a fourth millennium cemetery at Susa in Khuzestan, Iran, come painted pottery pieces, described by the excavators as showing the oldest representations of the Saluki type of hunting hound. In a study of the Susa pottery, the American archaeologists Frank Hole and Chera Wiley posited that as by this time people had long since lost the need to hunt purely for subsistence, since agriculture and animal husbandry were both well developed, the frequent portrayal of Salukis in art forms may suggest that apart from their use in hunting, they may have been important for prestige purposes, such as for gifts, dowries, bribes, tribute, and sacrifice. In short, well-bred hunting dogs could have facilitated and participated in many different types of social interaction, much as they still do today. For example, I heard stories in Syria illustrating the extraordinary value of the Saluki, whereby one hunter was ready to exchange an irrigation pump and a horse for one Saluki, while another even offered his daughter for one. And it was common to gift puppies to high-placed officials or sheikhs to curry favor with them. In ancient Egypt too, the walls of tombs as well as artifacts from the 3rd millennium onwards are often decorated with Salukis, some of which are even named. Sometimes these hounds are shown being delivered as tribute from the land of Punt, a mythical country to the south of Egypt, possibly extending into South Arabia, which might suggest that the Saluki was in fact an import. However that might be, it is only from the Egyptians that we have examples of mummified dogs to give us more tangible evidence of how the early Saluki might have looked. In the Levant and on Cyprus, artifacts showing Salukis from the 2nd millennium have been found. The ancient Greeks certainly used fast coursing hounds for hunting, and Arrian, the chronicler of Alexander the Great in the 4th century AD, gives a fine description of them that would fit a Saluki perfectly. Moreover, it is possible that it is to Seleucus, the first Nicator, one of Alexander's generals, and his eventual successor, who founded the Seleucid Empire in 305 BC, which at one time stretched over much of the Middle East, with its first capital at Seleucia in Mesopotamia, that we owe the very word Saluki. For Seleucia, translated into Arabic, became Saluqiya, from which derives Saluki. I was often amused to see Seleucid objects in the Mosul Museum labelled in English as Greyhound Dynasty. The Romans, too, were equally fond of hunting with Salukis and represented them often in their mosaics all over the Middle East and North Africa. The Saluki record is then carried on by the pre-Islamic poets of the Arabian Peninsula. Poetry has always been an important part of Arab culture. Indeed, the very word for poet, sha'ir, was held to be a person with supernatural knowledge, a wizard in league with spirits and enjoying magical powers. At that time, poetry was in the form of the qasida, poems with strict rules of composition that were meant to be recited. Some of the best of these have survived in a collection known in English as the 7 Golden Odes of Pagan Arabia, known also as the Mu'allaqat. Legend has it that in the 6th century, in the period known as the Jahiliyyah, the ignorance before the coming of Islam, there was an annual fair held at Ukaz, near Mecca, where poets met in rivalry and recited their best compositions, the most successful of which were written down, some say on fine Egyptian linen in letters of gold, and affixed to the door of the Kaaba in Mecca. Mu'allaqat is indeed a transliteration of the Arabic word for suspended, or hung. This is a colourful story, but it is generally dismissed by both Arab and Western commentators as improbable, not least because there is no reference to such an event in the Qur'an or in ancient histories of Mecca. Whatever the explanation, the 7 odes in the collection represent some of the finest descriptions of Bedouin life of the period, particularly the natural wonders of the desert, such as in Labid ibn Rabi'ah's rhapsody on a female oryx, likened to a pearl shining white in the night, which first loses her calf to wolves while sleeping among the sand dunes through a night of incessant rain, and then, as she searches desperately for it, she is pursued by hunters who let loose after her their 2, quotes, lop-eared hounds, which, when they catch up with her, she dispatches one after the other with her spear-like horns. In this ode, the hunter's hounds are merely described as lop-eared, and it may be open to question, therefore, whether they were necessarily Salukis. But it was a common stylistic device of poets of the time to use metonymy, the omission of the noun and the substitution of a characteristic adjective or distinctive phrase, and lop-eared was identified with Salukis. Moreover, as such hounds were the great favourite of hunters among the poets, and the only breed known to have been used by the Bedouin, then as now, for hunting in the desert, it might have been seen as superfluous to cite repeatedly the name, the breed by name. Another poet of roughly the same period in the late 6th century, Al-Muzarrid ibn Dirar al-Dhubyani, leaves no doubt, however, about the breed, when in a long qasida he refers quite specifically to Banat Saluki-like, the daughters of 2 Salukis. The classic saga-like qasida remained popular over the following centuries, but by the establishment of the Umayyad dynasty as caliphs, ruling from Damascus in 661 to 750, a new specific genre of hunting poetry, or tardia, as it was called, began to appear, though it only reached its full flowering under the Abbasid caliphs ruling from Baghdad in 749 to 1258, especially from the prolific pen of Hassan bin Hani, known as Abu Nuwas, who died in 814. His poetry ranged widely, and he was particularly known for his inspired verses on love and wine. That's why he's shown with a cup in his hand. However, the hunting hound, also held pride of place, as no less than 27 of his 55 poems of the chase described hunting with hounds. As with the pre-Islamic Qasida, in none of his hunting poems does Abu Nuwas employ the word Saluki as such, but he comes closest in a fine poem which reflects the traditional view of Arab geographers and lexicographers that the Saluki came originally from a place called Saluk near Ta'iz in modern Yemen, rather than the Seleucid Empire, even though Saluk was a town set in a mountainous area unsuited to the Saluki. Abu Nuwas wrote, "I will sing the praises of a hound who cannot be outstripped, of perfect conformation. He courses over all types of terrain. He was brought by kings from Saluk, as if on a long, flexible leash." In the chaos of the collapse of the Byzantine and Persian empires in the 7th and 8th centuries, when the Arabs burst out of the Arabian Peninsula to conquer the surrounding region and eventually wider from North Africa to China, it is clear the conquerors took their Salukis with them. Descriptions of them appear in the literature that has survived across the region, notably in Al-Hayawan, on animals, the encyclopedic work of the great 9th century Abbasid historian Al-Jahid. Notice here, a contemporary Syrian Saluki has the same kind of coat. And the dog also appeared in other works of literature. The Saluki also appears more graphically and increasingly in art forms. For example, the vault over the entrance to the Umayyad hunting palace at Qusayr Amra, east of Amman in Jordan, which is attributed to Walid, son of the Caliph Yazid, from about 723 AD, is covered with a vast mural of a pack of Salukis chasing onaga, or wild ass, into a circle of nets in which the reputed figure of the Caliph is shown spearing them, despite the Islamic prohibition on the representation of the human form in art. This prohibition is even more graphically ignored in the adjacent bathhouse. It is noteworthy that the use of hounds to drive game into a killing zone is of much earlier origin, as is attested by this petroglyph from nearby Tel Hani, dated to somewhere between the 1st century BC and the 4th century AD. So it is clear that, despite the injunction on Muslims not to handle dogs, which are generally regarded as najis or unclean, unless ritually cleansing themselves afterwards, right from the start of Islam, an exception was made for the Saluki. Grounds for this may be found in the Qur'an and in the Hadith, the sayings attributed to the Prophet. Thus, in Surah 5, Al-Ma'idah, the table, Muslims are specifically allowed to eat the meat of prey caught by, quotes, trained hounds, which this prey has obviously not been ritually slaughtered by having its throat cut. In the Hadith, this permission is qualified by the proviso that the basmallah, in the name of God, is pronounced before the hounds are released for the chase. At the time of the Prophet in the Hijaz, the only trained hounds used for hunting such prey were Salukis. There was a brief time when the Prophet issued an order that all dogs should be slaughtered to prevent rabies, especially black dogs with orange pips over their eyes, a common Saluki coloration. But the order was modified to exclude useful hunting, herding and guarding dogs. So the Saluki continued to enjoy its privileged position, and as unto today, it was allowed inside the Bedouin tent, and its companionship was enjoyed without inhibition. As Abu Nuwas wrote, "I will sing the praises of a hound whose owner's good fortune is assured by his tremendous efforts. All the good things that have come from him, all the assistance they have comes from him. His master is always like a slave to him. At night, he brings him nearest to his bed. If he is uncovered, his master puts on him his own coat. He has a blaze, and his legs are white. His excellent conformation is pleasing to the eye, also the receding corners of his mouth and his long muzzle. Gazelles are really in trouble when he is hunting. He relishes his hard attacks on them, hunting them down, 20 of them, in his headlong course. What a fine hound you are, without equal." Despite the devastation wreaked upon the Abbasid Empire by the Mongols in the 13th century, the Saluki survived and frequently appears in art forms from Persia, Ottoman Turkey, Mughal India, and it had already long been established in China too, thus maintaining its special status as the hunting companion of the nobility. It seems also to have been carried to Europe, possibly initially by returning to crusaders, and it often appears in major works of art, particularly from some of the great Italian masters, such as Veronese. Even Queen Victoria had one from Turkey, which was painted by Lancia. Traditions die hard, but right across the region in the last 60, 70 years or so, major upheavals such as revolutions, wars, migrations, and the settlement of the nomads have profoundly affected the old way of life. And the Saluki has not come through unscathed. Even as recently as 1980, when I first became involved with Salukis in Iraq, they were still regarded as a treasure to be strictly protected and given, never sold, only to assured owners. The huge increase in oil wealth of the Gulf states has changed all that and opened up a market for Salukis. Fresh impetus to the commercialization of the breed came about 10 years or so ago from the development of a new form of sport in the Gulf, Saluki racing. It had been tried first in the mid-1990s in Al Ain, Abu Dhabi, but it was not a success on an oval track in a stadium. However, they then tried a different, more natural approach by adapting a straight section of a couple of kilometers of a camel racetrack. At the start, a blindfolded gazelle is presented to the hounds to fire up their enthusiasm. It is then discreetly replaced by a stuffed gazelle, suspended from a boom mounted on a pickup. The hounds are then released, and the vehicle is driven parallel with the course which the hounds pursue, while the hounds pursue the stuffed creature, over distances up to 2.5 or even more kilometers. The events are attended by crowds of mainly young people, and the winning owners are often handsomely rewarded. As a consequence, some of the young sheikhs now maintain huge racing establishments to be compared with the hunting kennels of the Abbasid rulers. Some purists in the West decry this new sport as they believe it will lead to a demand for a sprinter rather than an all-round hunter. But such views ignore the fact that in its traditional role, the Saluki has always pursued the gazelle more or less in a straight line, very much as on the straight track. Certainly, the sport has revived great interest in this aspect of the Arabs' cultural heritage, and it often forms part of the festivals that some of the Gulf rulers support in order to keep their history and traditions alive in the public memory, though sometimes with a modern twist of camel bling. Moreover, changing attitudes internationally towards the preservation of wildlife have led to the introduction of hunting bans or restrictions in many of the Saluki's countries of origin. This has given rise to fears that the Saluki will lose some of its innate hunting characteristics. However, the hunting bans are often circumvented, not least by those who can afford to take their hounds with them on hunting expeditions to those countries where hunting is still allowed. Or the hounds are muzzled and are allowed to chase but not catch gazelle in a simulated hunt. So, one way or another, the Saluki is still being bred with the ability to perform its traditional role. However, its situation today is in a state of constant evolution and change, and it has to adapt to new circumstances, such as being accompanied to the hunt with their owners mounted on motorcycles, or being conveyed there in the back of a pickup. I even spotted a Saluki supermarket in Al Ain. Thus, the special qualities that have seen it through the vicissitudes of millennia seem likely to continue to ensure its survival in the future. And on that note, let me end where I began in Mesopotamia, where on my last visit to Iraq, I was delighted to see the younger generation being introduced to hunting with Salukis in the traditional manner. And let us not forget, the Saluki is still being celebrated in art, in this calligraphy by Taha al-Hiti, who's in the audience this evening, who also did the logo for BISI. And finally, it also appears in the art of Gillian Hayward on the cover of my book, which is autobiographical and a travelogue around the Saluki world. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for that rich world of learning, but whole new worlds opened up to me, so thank you very much indeed. I'm sure there must be questions that you have as a result of that, or anybody like to? I have one, but I'll yes, please. Yeah.
Thank you. I have a haunting question actually, which is, what is the differences between Salukis? Oh, sorry. Thank you. A question is, what is the differences between Salukis and greyhounds, and why are they called differently when they look so similar?
Right, good question. The Saluki is, if you like, a middle distance to long distance runner. The greyhound is a sprinter. So the musculature is quite different. In a greyhound, it is what we call bunched. From the back, a greyhound has massive thigh muscles. The Saluki has long, thin muscles. And they have actually experimented on the racetrack in Abu Dhabi, running greyhounds against Salukis. And the greyhound wins easily over the first 500-600 meters, and then the Saluki begins to take over. And sadly, the greyhounds never know when they've had enough. They can't cool down except through their mouth, and sometimes they actually drop dead at about 800,000 meters, whereas the Saluki will go on running all day. But actually in the Gulf, they call the greyhound the Saluki Inglesi.
So, I am going to buy the book, but the question I have, does it tell us how many Salukis you've had in your life?
Oh gosh, about a dozen, I suppose.
And when was the first one?
The first one was from Iraq in 1986, from the Kurds, who are great breeders of Salukis.
Thank you.
When our last Saluki died, I said to my husband, either you take another Saluki or you keep me, because Salukis were always at the back of his mind, and I was always second best. So we were without dogs, Salukis, for 3 years, and then I relented and we acquired a greyhound from Battersea Dogs Home, a rescue greyhound. So the next lecture will be on greyhounds, I should think.
I knew from your book that all the Salukis you saw in Baghdad, I think, were clipped in either one ear or both. But I didn't realize that the tradition goes back, as one of your slides
Yes.
to at least 3,600 BC. Can you offer any explanation as to why humankind should have adopted this practice?
Well, it's a question I frequently asked as I traveled around the region, and I was given a variety of explanations. Some actually said for beauty. Others said for speed, aerodynamically. Others to prevent damage when they're running through bushes, because the ears get easily torn. Others even claimed that when the hound is at full stretch galloping, its back claws scratch the ears as it runs, but I've never actually seen that. So, you pays your money and takes your choice. But it is a very old custom. There's even a story that in Mecca, in the early days of Islam, animals that were to be spared sacrifice had their ears cut. Maybe there's a connection.
Can I ask if there are any other breeds of dog which can I ask if there are any other breeds of dog which can be traced back so far, I think like to 3000 BC, because one thinks most of the modern breeds are only sort of 17th century or something.
Or later. I am told that the husky breed has a very long history too. But I'm not aware that it's been represented in art forms in the way that the Saluki has, or that it has held such a position of prestige in quite the same way. As I said, the companion of kings. I'm not sure the huskies fit in the same category. Yeah.
Terry, just an anecdote. When I worked in the Iraq Museum, Ralph and Rose Solecki, who excavated at Shanavar, were there. The Iraqis never called them Ralph or Rose Solecki, they called them Al-Saluki. Never got there. Yeah, Al-Saluki.
There is a breed that's very closely related, I think. It's the Hungarian Vizsla. I don't know, is it more of a greyhound or more of a Saluki?
There are various breeds in Eastern Europe. What's it called now? The Magyar and the Hort. These are similar, somewhere between a greyhound and a Saluki. It's probable that these were hounds that were taken from the east during Russian occupation, particularly of Central Asia, taken back, crossed with greyhounds, and a new breed developed. I think that's it.
I take advantage to ask.
Oh, yes, sorry. Yes.
I was just interested in the henna on the
Yes.
feet. How does that help protect?
Well, they say the henna, you wouldn't believe this, but to apply it to the dog's feet is not just a matter of painting it on and leaving it. They mix the henna powder into a paste. They apply the paste to all 4 feet. They wrap the paste onto the feet with cloth and then put plastic bags over them, and they leave it for 24 hours if the dogs don't tear it off before then. But it's a long process, and they say that the henna hardens the pads and protects them. You probably saw that some of the terrain is very stony, hard. But on the other hand, they put it also on the ears sometimes and on the tail. That's just for decoration, for beauty, as they say.
Fantastic. Well, I've had it's a revelation in terms of my understanding of this, so thank you very much indeed. Now I'd like to invite, thank you, our patron. I'd now like to invite our president to issue a vote of thanks, Dr. John Curtis.
Oh.
Well, thank you so much, Terence, for that wonderful lecture. As Paul has told us, this is the first BISI event since early in 2020, and there's been no better way to celebrate this auspicious occasion than having a lecture by Sir Terence. As you know, he is the Vice President of BISI, and he was, for nearly 10 years or so, the chairman of the Friends of Basra Museum. This was an organization set up in 2010 to promote a new museum in Basra, and it's very gratifying that this project has now been completed and the museum itself is fully open. And I should say that Friends of Basra Museum is now under the auspices of BISI, which is especially gratifying. So thank you very much for that, Terence. I first met Terence and Lise in Iraq in the mid-1990s. when we were excavating in northern Iraq, and it was a great pleasure to see you. You were wonderful hosts in Baghdad, very encouraging of our work, and it was very much appreciated. So thank you indeed for that. And then after your retirement from the diplomatic service, we next came into contact when you visited the British Museum doing research on your contribution to the book about British missions in the Middle East, when you were writing about Iraq and about Oman as well, I think, in the same book. Very important contributions. More recently, we had discussions about the material in the horse exhibition, which you showed some photographs of, the so-called Saluki and the horse. And I think we both had doubts that these objects could actually date from the early Neolithic period. But nobody could say so because, of course, they'd been presented to the King of Saudi Arabia as being Neolithic. Well, coming on to the lecture, I think I thought actually that I'd met 5 of your Salukis. I'm not quite so sure about that now. I think I met 2 in Iraq, 2 after you came back, at some time in London, and then the 5th one recently, but now I discover that I didn't meet a Saluki at all recently, but a greyhound. And I'm afraid it shows my ignorance that I can't tell the difference between a Saluki and a greyhound. But I must say, having acquired a dog ourselves recently, or rather our son has acquired one, a black Labrador, I now understand how much work it is actually looking after a dog. So I'm got great admiration for you for looking after 2 Salukis at the same time, at least on 2 different occasions. But Sir Terence is, of course, much more than a dog lover or a dog owner. As we've seen, he's done very, very serious research into the history of Salukis and made a very great contribution to the subject, which, of course, is outlined in this book here. So thank you, Terence, for sharing with us this evening your thoughts on the history of Salukis. It's been a fascinating lecture. Thank you very much indeed. Just what we needed.
So just as to say that, of course, we are moving towards, we hope, normal times, but we're not quite there yet. So although we've been able to sit here without masks and so on, we won't, unfortunately, be able to have a reception in the normal fashion, but we hope that will be something we'll be able to get back to in the future. But you have the opportunity, of course, to come and enjoy the book. So please take advantage of the moment if you want one to come and speak to Terence. And as Joan is leading the charge.
So you have, have you told us